My first guest is assistant editorial page editor James Freeman. How you doing, James?
Good.
To talk about the fallout from the very public exit of a Goldman Sachs employee yesterday. Welcome, James.
Thanks.
Greg Smith's little stunt cost Goldman more than $2 billion in market value yesterday, and people all over the globe, it seems, are talking about this op-ed in the New York Times. James, what's your reaction to the article itself and the stir that it's caused?
Yeah, I think there's really not much in it, and it's so you ask why has this caused such a stir, and I think it's only Goldman really, because obviously a big organization. Unhappy kind of mid-level employees leave all the time. It's not a big news story. If he were maybe the CEO or one of the senior folks to say the culture is broken here, that's probably a story. But and I know there's been a lot of questioning of him and his motives. And boy, he worked there a long time. Wouldn't he have figured it out earlier? But I think it. I think it really. No, and I don't mean that I agree with his characterization necessarily. But whether you like it or you don't like it, I think the Goldman culture in 2000 was not that different from the Goldman culture now.
Let me ask you about that, because it's not a partnership now. Let's back up. The argument here that Goldman was putting its own profits interest ahead of those of its clients,
right.
and he cited the culture, and he says there's been something of a shift. And I wanted to ask you about that cultural argument. It's not the same kind of company. It's a publicly traded place now. It wasn't before. Traders run the place. Do they bring a different mentality, a different culture?
I think it's a fair point that over time, like a lot of the big investment banks, there was more of an emphasis, more power exercised by traders than by the investment bankers who traditionally raise capital for companies or help them to. That shift was well underway long before he got to the firm. People have actually been writing this story for decades. I'm a little skeptical. There's a tendency for Wall Street old-timers, if you will, to say back when I was doing this business, it was very virtuous, and now these people have gone off the rails. And I think I'm a little skeptical of that because it feeds into, I think, what the general media narrative of the crisis has been, which is greed took over.
Yes.
And I think if you look at this in a reasonable fashion, you realize that there's always been greed on Wall Street, and there's always greed in business. And what markets do is they channel that greed into more or less productive pursuits. And so I think what we're seeing at Goldman is we have a broken system where you have too big to fail banks, the government. And even now, after the crisis, Goldman has an implied government backing, like a lot of the big banks. Yeah. And so people are not so sure that the normal market mechanisms work anymore, and so they start trying to judge these places on other criteria, sort of subjective ideas of fairness or greed or what have you.
I want to talk about greed a little bit. He does cite it, the sort of rapaciousness in the environment at the place or in Wall Street in general, and I think that's one of the reasons this piece has resonated with a lot of people, because that is that is one of the narratives in terms of how we got into the financial crisis. Wall Street was too greedy, and I always, it's interesting how people who use that argument, how selectively they apply that term. When public sector unions are threatening to shut down the subway system unless they can continue to, retire at age 50 without paying any money towards their health care or anything, they're not criticized as being greedy, James. When teachers' unions want, full-time pay for 9 months' work and tenure after a couple of years in the classroom, and they're not greedy, but Wall Street is greedy. But I think there's a more serious point here, which is that if that narrative, that greed narrative, wins the day, it sort of it sucks all the oxygen out of the conversation, and no one's talking about some of the more probable causes of the financial crisis. The easy money policies, the public policies in Washington that encouraged banks to make loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them back. I mean, greed seems to push those arguments to the side.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just an easy explanation, but it means that you ignore a lot of the real problems, because the point is, greed is everywhere in human activity. And so what was different about 2008 is what you really want to find out.
Right.
And along with what you mentioned, I would talk about the government forcing banks to hold AAA rated securities, and these are AAA ratings. This is a rating system created by the government. So there are a lot of those structural things that haven't been fixed.
We've been critical of Goldman on the editorial page at times in recent years, and you touched on some of that. But we've talked about its close ties to Washington, not Wall Street's close ties in general, but Goldman's in particular. You know, a few of our recent Treasury secretaries have gone through Goldman.
Right.
The way that they went through this financial crisis and came out of it, unique to Goldman. I mean, our point is that there are legitimate criticisms of Goldman's operations. This guy just simply didn't get into. Didn't go there.
I think that is one thing that strikes you about this piece, is there are not a lot of facts in it. No names, no specific incidents. I guess calling people a muppet is not a good thing, but it's not necessarily a crime against humanity. So I think you're right. The reason not to like Goldman, or the legitimate reason to criticize it, is that they get advantages that a smaller firm doesn't. And this goes back to the financial crisis. Not just Goldman, other firms. You recall both Goldman and Morgan Stanley were approved as bank holding companies over a weekend. Don't try that if you're a small struggling finance company in Cleveland. So I think that figuring out how to bring a real market back and the freedom to fail, the reforms that weren't done by all the people talking about greed and how to fix that, I think is really where we want to go. And then you don't have to worry about, is Goldman fair to clients, because we have a free market and clients don't like them, they don't trade with them.
Okay. We're gonna leave it there, James. But thank you very much for joining us.